This is that it will ferment the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas.
How much of it goes in?
That's probably about right. Yeah,
okay,
that's
good.
it.
Okay, so then, is that it?
Yep, that's it. We now have to wait 5 days, I'm afraid.
5 days, okay. Well,
it.
we're going to have to wait 5 days, so just talk among yourselves, will you?
In Sumerian times, beer was unfiltered and cloudy. So they invented the drinking straw, probably a hollow reed, to avoid getting a mouthful of the bitter residue from the bottom of the jar. And they sucked up beer out of communal pots. I think we'll stick to mugs.
Ah, it's quite nice.
Very good.
It's quite bitter,
Honey.
but it hasn't got any hops in it.
No, they arrived in the 17th century.
So this is thousands of years before hops.
Much before that.
Beer was very important to them. Everyone drank it, not just the men, but the women and the children too, because it was nutritious and also practically sterile because it's so acidic, which meant not only it was much safer than the water from the river, but they even used it to wash wounds and things. Did you know that 40% of the entire grain harvest went into making beer? It can't be anything like that today.
No, it's about 10 to 15%
Exactly. Now, the goddess of beer, I think, was called Ninkasi, is that right? So I think we should drink a toast to Ninkasi.
Ninkasi.
Be quite good down the pub. To Ninkasi!
And the beer we made with that 3,000-year-old recipe tastes at least as good as the stuff in my local pub. Of course, a little overindulgence in the amber nectar must have led to exactly the same problems then as it does today. But the Mesopotamians were ready for that. Records show a variety of ways of dealing with public drunkenness. And pubs were also regulated by another amazing Mesopotamian creation, written law.
So, the pubs were actually governed by laws, were they?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. There is a huge monument in Paris which is known as the Code of Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, a great pillar of diorite. And it's inscribed with many laws about society, one of which does talk about a pub, if you like, that the alewife in charge must make sure that she doesn't cheat the punters who are drinking the beer. She has to give them the right amount for the barley that they pay with. And it's just one of a huge range of different topics in society which are covered in this law code.
So they were actually literally set in stone?
That's exactly what they were. When Hammurabi came to the throne, he wanted to make a statement in front of his population and in front of the gods about what he was going to do during his reign. So this law code was written out, put in the public, in the marketplace, theoretically for anybody to read who wanted to. Of course, most people couldn't. But it's a sort of statement of principle of law. It's not a law code that, as it were, judges quoted from in a dispute and said, it says here in the laws, so we're going to do that. It's more do as you would be done by.
So was it just specific crime, specific punishment?
Well, in a way, yes, but they drew their material from daily life. So a good illustration would be the case of a mother with several sons dying. Then her father would have no claim on the dowry, which in Mesopotamian terms was very important, but the law would stipulate that it had to be divided equally between her own children. And that was the sort of thing they were concerned with.
So it was really socially useful. It wasn't, you know, absolutely nailed down specific crime.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly.
And of course, we would never have had the Code of Hammurabi if the Sumerians hadn't invented writing. Now, tell me about these alewives.
It's hard to imagine a world without writing. No books, no libraries, no email, no text messaging. But none of this would have been possible without sheep.
5,500 years ago, the villages of Mesopotamia were fast growing into busy towns. Trade was very important, and with that, it became necessary to keep an accurate record of how many sheep and how much beer and grain was passing in and out of the stores. So I want this goat, I don't want all these sheep, actually, keep this one. Oh.
In a time before writing, the Mesopotamians came up with the idea of using different shaped tokens to represent different animals. So in theory, if I want to buy, say, 5 goats and 4 sheep, all I have to do is drop the right number of shaped tokens into a clay envelope called a bula as the animals walk past me. I then have a permanent record of how many animals I've bought.
I've lost my goat.
Well, that's the theory anyway.
Well, the system works. I've got my 5 goats and my 4 sheep. But as you can see, it's pretty difficult to count sheep and count tokens at the same time. So to make it simpler, some bright spot came up with the idea of just pressing the token onto the outside of the clay and making a shape. Pretty soon, drawings of the tokens were being used instead of the tokens themselves, so there was no need for a bulla to keep them in. Flat clay tablets were much easier to work with and fitted neatly into the writer's palm. A tool called a stylus, made out of bone or wood, was used to mark the soft clay. Remind you of anything? Now, you could draw a picture of a token, but it was much easier just to make a mark. A Mesopotamian stylus left very neat little wedge-shaped marks. The first written words were fashioned from these distinctive wedges, a style known as cuneiform. Cuneiform was the main script of the ancient Near East and lasted for nearly 3,000 years. When they excavated the ancient city of Ebla, they found 17,000 of these clay tablets. You can still see the marks left by the shelves that they rested on in the royal library. When cities fell in battle, the victors torched the buildings, but that very act of destruction ensured the preservation of the tablets as they were fired and baked hard by the flames. Only a few highly trained scribes learned the art of cuneiform. The vast majority of the population, right up to kings, was illiterate. This private letter begins, "Say to the Lord, my king." So we know he couldn't read it for himself, which meant the scribes could wield enormous power. I wonder if they ever pulled the wool over anyone's eyes.
Once they had writing, the Mesopotamians weren't about to stop at just keeping records of sheep and goats. Before long, they were producing the world's first novels, although those books were written on clay. One of the greatest stories of all time is the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. This is the tale of a legendary king of Sumer who sets out to discover the secret of immortality. Along the way, he defeats a demon, he sees a friend die, and he learns important lessons about mortal life.
Doesn't the flood get into Gilgamesh?
Yes, it's the last bit of the story, because when he crosses the water of death, the boatman tells Gilgamesh about his own adventures and how the flood came and destroyed the world and an ark was built, rather like in the book of Genesis.
So are they the same story?
They are, in the sense that the story in the Bible must derive from a Middle Eastern narrative which has long been in circulation.
Right. But generally what we read in Gilgamesh tells us quite a lot about Mesopotamia, does it? I mean, it's not meant to be history, but...
No, it's literature, it's myth and literature on a high level, but it also tells us a lot about the world in which Gilgamesh lived, I mean, because he was a historical character, and the kind of impression you get of the bustling city of Uruk, which was a huge city, trade, contact, wars, all the sort of things that are incidental to the narrative are in fact a rather faithful picture of what life must have been like at that time.
In his quest for immortality, Gilgamesh travels to the island of Dilmun, the modern state of Bahrain in the Arabian Gulf. Here he dives to the bottom of the sea, searching for the plant of everlasting life.
Now, in fact, the very first line of the story, and some say its true title, is "He who saw the deep." And incredibly, that is the first ever recorded dive in history. Now, to get there, Gilgamesh ties a heavy stone to his feet to drag him into the ocean. And that gives us a clue as to what men were really diving for here back in Mesopotamian times. Because tying weights to their feet to get to the bottom of the sea is exactly what pearl divers do.
Pearls have been harvested here for some 5,000 years, and Bahrain once supplied 80% of the world demand. But after the Japanese came up with the idea of cultivating pearls back in the 1920s, the bottom fell out of the natural pearl market. Since ancient times, Bahrainian pearls were prized for their beauty. That's thought to be partly due to the unusual